Good morning, dear participants, and welcome to this webinar where we will talk about the Summit Project experience on disappearance of unaccompanied children in Europe. And my name is Evgenia Generalova, and I'm Communications and Knowledge Manager for Child Protection Hub. And before I give the floor to our speakers, Federica Toscano and Rebecca O'Donnell, I would like to give you a very brief overview of the platform, so as you feel comfortable using it. So as you have noticed, you're muted and you don't have microphones, but in case you want to communicate with us, the organizers or the speakers or with each other, please use the chat box. You can find it below in the right-hand corner. Can you please write there now if you can hear me well? Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, please pay attention to the polls we are going to have during this webinar. I will put one now. If you could take 10 seconds to answer it, please, for us. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And there will be more polls coming from the speakers during the webinar. If in case you lose the sound, the first thing you should do is to make sure that the speaker icon, which is on the top black bar, is green. Make sure it's always green. In case still you have any technical issues, please write to us in the chat box. And also next to the speaker icon, you can see an icon of a man with a raised hand. Please feel free to use it if you want to show any emotions, suggestions, to ask us speak louder, slower, or anything similar. And now I will put the presentation for our speakers and I will give the floor to them. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Very good. Okay, Rebecca, I think you have to unmute your microphone.
Thank you.
Good. Hello everyone. My name is Federica Toscano. I work for Missing Children Europe, where I'm the focal point on missing unaccompanied migrant children. I have been coordinating the project summit during the last couple of years, together with Rebecca and other partners. I'm really glad, and I want to thank a lot the Child Hub for having organized this webinar and giving us the opportunity to promote the results of this project and inform about what we have discovered in these months.
Very briefly, good morning to everybody. As Federica said, I'm Rebecca O'Donnell from Child Circle, and Child Circle is a Brussels-based organisation that focuses on child protection measures in EU issues, in EU laws and actions, and that of course includes the area of asylum and migration. And we were very happy to be a partner with Missing Children in this summit project. I'm going to switch off now, and I think Federica will do the same in terms of the camera so that we can focus on the presentation.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, maybe just briefly about Missing Children Europe as well. We are the European Federation for Missing and Sexually Exploited Children. We are a network of 30 organizations in 26 European countries. And we focus mainly on protecting children from disappearance and preventing them from all violence and abuse that could lead to and result from the fact that they are missing. With Rebecca, we have agreed that we will start with a general introduction of the project and the reasons why the project was developed and what we have discovered with the project. And then she will dig into a specific aspect that I think you will all find interesting. But first, what we would like to hear from you is who are you actually? So we would like to know what kind of profession you undertake every day and what are your competencies, because this will help us in tailor a little bit what we're going to present here today. Thanks for those that are replying. Good, so I see that the majority of the participants are involved in advocacy activities, and we have a lot of professionals working in reception centers, and we have some immigration asylum professional, very good, and policymakers, good. That's really good. Thanks a lot. This is very helpful for us. So I will proceed with a short explanation of why it is important not to understand the matter of the disappearance of unaccompanied children, and also what can be done to reduce the number of unaccompanied children who go missing. So, as you all know, children make a large proportion of all migrants and refugees that arrived and are arriving in the European Union. We all know about the number that was published by the European Commission. According to national reports, last year more than 89,000 unaccompanied children arrived in Europe, but we have to take into account that this number only refers to those children who actually applied for asylum, because there is not systematic registration in all European countries of those unaccompanied children who actually did not apply for asylum. So this is important to know when we actually read the number 89,000. We thought with Rebecca that it would have been interesting also to give you a little bit of an overview of how many unaccompanied children have arrived in Europe in 2016. And of course, this is not comprehensive data because this is an exercise that we'll be able to do only at the end of the year. But we have already some indications that give us an idea of how important are the arrivals of unaccompanied children in Europe, even in 2016. So we know that in Hungary, children make up to 40% of the people that are waiting to enter in the country. In Greece, children are 35% of total arrivals. And among you, if I'm not mistaken, there are professionals working in Greece, and they can testify even better than what we can do, that at the moment the shelter system in Greece is not able to provide shelter for all the children that actually arrived in 2016. And according to the Fundamental Rights Agency, at the 31st of August, 1,500 unaccompanied children were without shelter. In Germany, we know that in the first 6 months of 2016, 9,000 unaccompanied children applied for asylum. And in Italy, 93% of all children arrived by sea are unaccompanied. And in total, this sums up to 6,658 unaccompanied children. The majority of them are Eritreans. So when we talk about the matter of missing unaccompanied children, we talk about a matter that is not new to us. We have reports that report a very important number of unaccompanied children going missing, at least since 2005. These reports show that up to 50% of unaccompanied children go missing from reception centers, especially within the 48 hours after their arrival. And these reports talk mainly of the situation in Belgium, in the UK, in France, in Italy, and are reports from national authorities or, for example, from Frontex. So we had already an idea of the fact that the problem of unaccompanied children going missing was important since few years. But indeed, the fact that in 2015 and in 2016 the number of unaccompanied children arriving to Europe increased so much makes it even more concerning, and it underlines once again the importance to look better into this problem. So we know, probably you've all heard that in 2015, Europol published a statement declaring that at least 10,000 unaccompanied children went missing, and many of them were feared to be victim, to have become or to have returned into trafficking. In 2016, while this statement indeed raised more awareness on the matter and created more interest from authorities at national and European level on what could be done to avoid the disappearance of unaccompanied children, for what we know so far, in 2016, the situation is indeed far from being ideal and from having changed, because the Fundamental Rights Agency reports that in Sweden, 7-8 unaccompanied children are reported missing every week. In Slovenia, we know that 80% of children disappear from the open reception centers that exist at the moment. The German authorities have reported that at the moment almost 9,000 children that have registered entering in the country have been missing, and more than 800 of them are aged under 13. And in Italy, Oxfam reported a few weeks ago that 28 children per day go missing. So we know that from previous work and also from the work done in this project, that in many cases, unaccompanied children, when they go missing, their disappearance is not reported. And often the normal channel used to report this disappearance and to follow up on this disappearance are not used when the child is a foreigner and is an unaccompanied migrant child. So an example of this problem in reporting the disappearance is the data from the caseload of the hotlines for missing children. From our network in 2015, only 1 to 2% of the cases were cases of missing unaccompanied children, which we know is not representative of the reality. We know that many more are the unaccompanied children who go missing, but as we said, we know also that these disappearances are not reported to the channels that are normally activated when a child goes missing. And this was also acknowledged by the Commission, who carried out a study in 2013, a study called Missing Children in the European Union, Mapping Data Collection and Statistic, which actually stated one of the findings of this study was the fact that in many countries there is still a standard no action period before reporting the disappearance of a child, and in many cases this is applying specifically to cases of migrant children going missing. We know, for example, this is the case in Denmark, where if the child is aged above 15 years old, and a 24-hour intervention threshold is set. We know that this is also the case in Finland for all children going missing, or at least this was the case in 2013. In 2013, also in Hungary, there was a distinction between children that do and do not seek asylum. It was noted that whilst asylum-seeking children rarely would go missing in 2013, non-asylum seeking children often disappeared within the 24 or 48 hours, and they were usually not recorded and reported until this time was elapsed. And we also know that only a minority of countries in the European Union have legal or procedural regulation on missing migrant children, and in those that had were only 4, and were Austria, Finland, Ireland, and Romania. So this indeed in 2013 was the picture that the Commission described of the situation. And this was the reason why Missing Children Europe, together with the partnership, decided that it was the time to work on this matter and study this matter further and try to understand how we can actually reduce the number of unaccompanied children going missing. So first of all, we try to understand why do children go missing. and we actually have here listed some of the main reasons according to our research. Indeed, in many cases, there is an interest of the child to apply for protection in another country. We know also that it is often assumed that the child would go missing because it has an interest in applying for protection in another country, or it has the interest to move to another country. And that's one of the main reasons why authorities decide often not to follow up, because they underestimate the possibility that this child would have decided to move because not because of his own will, but maybe because of reasons that can be the fact that he has been a victim of trafficking, or that he has been forced to move, etc. Sorry, I see a question from Pedro. What is the average length of a no-action period throughout the EU? In average, we have seen that there is 24 to 48 hours no-action period when this exists. And the 4 countries that at the moment have policies for missing migrant children in 2013 were Austria, Finland, Ireland, and Romania. So we also know the fact that often procedures for family reunification and for asylum itself are very lengthy and complex, and children often are very discouraged by this. And especially when it comes to family reunification, when they hear that it will take months to get reunited to their family in another country, and there is the risk that this will not actually happen and their application will be rejected, they simply decide to continue on their own. This also goes together with the fact that often these children don't receive enough information on what is the procedure about and what are the different stages they will have to go through, or they receive it in a way that is not understandable for them, or in a way that is not enough child-friendly, and this can contribute to their decision to use other means to either be reunited with their family or continue with their migration plan. They often don't trust authorities because of their background, or because they are told not to do so. They may be victim of trafficking, and they may not identify themselves as victim of trafficking, and for this reason they may decide to leave, to go back to their exploiters. And one other very important reason for unaccompanied children to go missing is the fear to be sent back to another EU country or to their country of origin. And this has been seen, for example, in Sweden, when the European Commission decided to stop Dublin transfers towards Greece. As soon as this decision came into force, the NGOs working in Sweden have realized that less children were going missing, which actually proved the fact that the fear to be sent back to a country where they don't want to stay is indeed one of the main reasons why these children go missing. But this is just a list. So we would like to know from you and your experience, especially because we've seen that here there are so many people that work in social services and reception centers. What is, in your experience, the most pressing reason to leave for unaccompanied children? Maybe Evgenia, could you put on the poll? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. This is very interesting. Indeed, it corresponds to what we have discovered with the Summit Project and our work. So it seems that the interest to apply for protection in another country is at the moment prominent. The length of complexity of procedure, of course, as well. The fear of being sent back to the country of origin, which is often the case for children that are approaching the age of 18. For which often the protection is supposed to stop as soon as they became adults, and also the fact of being victim of trafficking. Thanks a lot for your answer. This is extremely interesting for us. So all this consideration and this concern led to the decision to launch the Summit project. The Summit project is a project, the long name of the Summit project is Safeguarding Unaccompanied Migrant Children from Going Missing by Identifying Best Practices and Training Actors on Interagency Cooperation. So we actually decided to look into the challenges encountered by several professionals working with unaccompanied children, especially when there is a need to cooperate between them. And we tried to look into the situation in several countries of the European Union that have a specific geographical position or a specific, let's say, role in the migration path of a child on the move. And this is why we combined the experience of professionals working in Italy, Spain, Cyprus and Greece with those working in the United Kingdom, Belgium and Ireland, who are often considered countries of destination by children on the move. We have interviewed and surveyed professionals working in reception centers, social services, guardians as well, law enforcement and hotlines for missing children, because what we wanted was to try to understand the specific challenges encountered by those that are in charge of care for migrant children and children in general, and those that are often in charge of following up on cases of disappearances and all cases of trafficking, which is the case for law enforcement and hotlines for missing children. So first and foremost, we wanted to understand better what were the challenges encountered by professionals working with unaccompanied children, because this would have been the basis to proceed with creating some useful tools addressing those challenges, the tools that we're going to discuss later on during this presentation. So indeed, the fact that among the main challenges that we have found with the study that we have conducted, indeed the fact that information about unaccompanied children is collected by different actors at different moments is an obstacle to cooperation between agencies. And also it's an obstacle when actually the child goes missing, because information being held by different actors in different places may often be this may often create another obstacle for law enforcement to actually immediately follow up on the report of this disappearance when this happens, of course. The fact that reception conditions are very poor in some countries was indeed a challenge reported by several professionals. This increases indeed the vulnerability and the risks faced by unaccompanied children. Children often find themselves in situations of detention, others are placed in big reception centers, they are packed with other unrelated persons without adequate care and information, and often they experience physical and other forms of violence, which indeed increases the level of vulnerabilities of those children and may lead to the decision to leave that situation. The fact that guardianship systems are lagging behind is also another challenge encountered by several professionals, because not all EU member states at the moment there is an efficient and effective guardianship system in place. In many cases, a guardian is appointed after several months after the child has been put into care, and guardians need to be trained very well in order to create a relationship of trust with the child. And we have seen that there are huge discrepancies between countries, but we have also seen that an efficient guardianship system really has an impact on the decision of the child to leave and the feeling that the child has towards the country that is hosting him. We've also seen that often, as mentioned before, disappearances are not reported or reported too late. The reporting of the disappearance is often done only for administrative purposes and not really towards the follow-up of the case. wanted to say something else. The fact that, yeah, again, the fact that there is often not reporting, it's sometimes due to the fact that the carers are not trained on existing procedures to report disappearances. And often, for example, they simply don't know how to report a disappearance, on who is the authority in charge of following up the case. And often the existence of network of hotlines for missing children is not known by those that take care of migrant children. And so this network is often not alerted of disappearance. Missing migrant children are indeed treated as a lower priority than other missing children, as already discussed earlier. We've also seen that there is a persistent lack of training of professionals on preventing and response to missing, in particular guardians, carers, and law enforcement. So what we have seen through the summit study and interviews and surveys conducted is that none of the interviewed law enforcement representatives have received training in preventing or responding to missing unaccompanied children. We've also seen that only 22% of the guardians and carers interviewed had actually received the training in preventing disappearance, and 12% of the guardians and carers were trained in how to respond to missing. So as you can see, indeed, these percentages are quite low and reveal the fact that there is the need to invest in training professionals in these matters. Another thing we have seen with the study is that there is no systematic risk assessment of for children arriving. And with risk assessment, we mean both the risk that the child would go missing and also the risks that the child could encounter when missing, which are indeed both very relevant when taking a decision on how to where to accommodate a child and what are the first action to take towards the child in care. And another big problem we have seen is the fact that cooperation across borders seems to be almost inexistent and depending solely on the willingness of the persons involved in the individual case, while actually there are systems that work cross-border to work on cases of missing children in general, but again, they are not activated when the child is an unaccompanied and migrant child. So here, this was an overview of the challenges, and I'm very curious to know if you as well have encountered some of these challenges, and what are, in your opinion, the most urgent to address. Thank you, Evgenia, for putting up the poll. I see immediately weak guardianship system. Then, right after weak guardianship system, it seems that, the situation is changing very fast. The lack of training, indeed, so we hope that this webinar will be useful in this sense. Yeah, the results are quite consistent. I'm happy to see that many of you agree with the findings of the summit study, and that indeed training and lack of and weak guardianship system are among those that we need to work on more. Thank you very much for your answers. So what we realized after having analyzed the results of the study was that it was very, very important to work on building bridges between the stakeholders involved in the situation of an unaccompanied child. So not only those that are responsible for the protection of migrant children in general, but between them and those that are experts in dealing with cases of missing children. And this is what we have been focusing as soon as the study highlighted the need. So from the challenges identified in the study, we have drafted and built a handbook. This handbook is a guidance. It's not supposed to explain you what to do and what not to do to prevent and respond to the disappearance of an unaccompanied child, but it's supposed to provide you with some examples of practices that have been adopted in some local or national situations and have proven to be successful. So what we wanted to do was to collect these practices that address the challenges identified earlier and to put them together in order for professionals working in Europe to maybe try to find inspiration from these practices and maybe apply them, of course, adapting them to the context in which they work. So the handbook that is available online in English and parts of it are translated in other languages. You can find all this material in the Missing Children Europe website. The handbook can be used directly by professionals, and with professionals I mean reception center operators, social services, hotlines for missing children, and law enforcement authorities. So this can be used in the everyday work, or it can also be the basis for training, because it includes several tools that can be used directly, but can also become the object of a training seminar or a training event for a specific profession or for different ones. So you will find in the handbook the European Commission principles on integrated child protection system, which have been the basis for our work. You can find some definitions that come from the main international convention and European law. We have thought that it was very important to collect those definitions in one place in order to avoid that different definitions and different descriptions are used in different countries. As these descriptions exist and have been adopted by European Union institutions or international stakeholders, we thought it was important to refer to them in our work. You will also find the guiding principles for preventing and responding to disappearance of unaccompanied children. That is the topic that Rebecca will develop in a few seconds. You will also find information on unaccompanied children as a specific target group, which we have included because this handbook addresses not only those that are experts in migrant children and unaccompanied children needs in general, but also those that are not so familiar with this topic, like, for example, law enforcement authorities. So we thought it was important to have also a part on this. And then you will find some tools but we will discuss this later. I will now leave the floor to Rebecca for her description of the principles that we have included in the handbook.
Thanks, Federica. That's a very clear presentation of all of the realities that are seen across Europe on a daily basis. We're turning to the more abstract issue of looking at the legal obligations that should apply. But our goal, the partner's goal, when developing the training in the handbook was indeed to be very practical, including in the section on legal principles. And there are a wide range of laws, and we'll see some of them in a moment, that apply and that are relevant to disappearances. And our aim in these guiding principles was to bring those laws together in a simple and clear way. There are, of course, as we all know, a lot of new EU laws and measures under development, and indeed at national level. So obviously we'll need to think about these too as we go. Now, I mean, at one level, the fundamental legal obligation for states is fairly straightforward. When children are deprived of their parents, the state has an obligation to provide special protection and assistance to them and to ensure their safety. And clearly, this obligation also involves trying to prevent their disappearance from state care and properly to respond to any disappearances. But obviously, it's clear from everything we've just heard about the research that preventing and responding to disappearances of children from third countries is in fact a very complex and sensitive task. And this is partly the case because of the group of children that we're looking at and the very diverse reasons for which a child might go missing. I mean, is a child who has gone missing trying to get to another country? Are they trying to join family? Or have they been lured away by individuals who will exploit them? It's also complex because of the range of actors involved. Measures to prevent and respond to disappearances relies on effective cooperation between actors who have very different responsibilities, including reception centre staff, guardians, social services, law enforcement and migration officials. So the guiding principles that we crafted needed to take account of the specific challenges associated both with the circumstances of this group of children and the different roles of actors that work with them. And for this reason, we wanted to establish a framework that could create a common understanding between actors on the basics. If we look now to the bodies of EU and international law that are relevant to disappearances, we can see that there are quite a few. Let's start with children's rights. Obviously, these are of central importance. We think here of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And of course, the best interest principle, the principle of the best interests of a child guide responses to the child's situation is very central. International and EU asylum, migration and trafficking laws also may apply directly to the situation of an unaccompanied child. And these, of course, set out obligations concerning assistance. For example, they set out guardianship obligations, and we'll look at that again. There are also specific child protection provisions about preventing and responding to violence, and they include provisions on risk assessments, and they often seek to ensure that actors have specialized skills and can share knowledge and information. And then we spoke of anti-trafficking measures in crime control. There are also smuggling and smuggling measures that can be relevant if a child has been smuggled in to Europe. EU data protection measures are also very relevant because, of course, we talked about the difficulties of sharing information on the situation of a child. We talked about the importance of it, but it can be a very practical stumbling block to cooperating with each other. So finding ways to handle sensitive data is essential to that cooperation. And we need to be bound by the laws relating to data protection. Federica also mentioned cross-border measures, and there are cross-border measures of very different kinds that can have a bearing on disappearances, but I'll just take the example of the Dublin III regulation, which is the EU law that allows for transfers of asylum-seeking persons, including children, between EU member states, and for the purposes of determining their claim in another country. And it does allow transfers for the purposes of family reunification in many situations. And we can see that these Dublin III rules, as they're called, could be a tool to prevent children from having to take matters in their own hands. But precisely as Federica said, at the moment, the procedures underpinning those transfers are very lengthy and very complex. And there's been, quite a lot of cases, for example, in Calais recently, where children really just cannot wait in those camps for, I think the lawyers calculated that it might be up to 11 months that they would have to wait if they were to go through those procedures. Now, the other relevant background is very much the European Commission's reflection paper on integrated child protection systems. And it identifies 10 principles which should guide bodies in working together on child protection. And these were set out in the handbook, so you can consult them there. And They do have a practical significance for work in the field. The principles influence EU work and often advocacy towards EU work in a variety of ways. For example, it influences EU policy approaches to the current situation. The recent communication from the Commission on the state of play of the EU agenda on migration notes that work is underway to employ a comprehensive approach for the protection of children throughout the migration chain. We also see the influence of these kinds of principles in the legal obligations, because EU measures require actors to working with children to receive special training. On EU research, the Fundamental Rights Agency did a mapping of national child protection systems, which very much resourced the Commission's reflections, and this research helped illustrate good practices and common challenges. Again, the Fundamental Rights Agency produced guardianship, a fact also that I mentioned in the comments box there in response to Justina's questions about guardianship. So there's both a mapping and a handbook. And then in terms of priorities for EU funding in the area, a lot of the DG Justice funding, or all of the DG Justice funding that's focusing on children, requires partners to have child protection procedures in place. And equally, many of the calls are looking for projects which support multidisciplinary work. So that's the background. Here are what we refer to as the guiding principles for responding to the situation of unaccompanied children. And the very basic starting point is, of course, that the fact that an unaccompanied child is from another country in no way relieves the state of its responsibility to try and prevent or respond to their disappearances. The state should always look at these children as children first and foremost. And as I said before, the Fundamental Rights Charter that's quoted there and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child are very clear on these issues. So that means also that child protection professionals should be involved, and child protection laws should be being applied alongside the immigration and sometimes criminal laws that may be relevant. Our second principle goes back to the research. We saw that if you engage with the child and their situation, that really may help discourage them from taking matters into their own hands and moving on to other countries on their own steam, or from putting their trust in smugglers or traffickers to help them get where they want to be, or to lure them away from where they should be. And there are EU legal provisions, there are international and national provisions which require states to provide children with information, with representation and access to proper procedures, including family reunification, and individual needs assessment and reception arrangements that are in their best interests are also required. So, key questions to think about are, have children enough support upon arrival? And the immediate appointment of a guardian, as we saw, can be very helpful to reduce disappearances. Are children being given enough information? Can they reunite with their family and relatives in other member states? We saw the challenge, the potential of Dublin III to address this, but also the challenge in developing procedures that would be effective in this regard. Are the special needs of children properly screened? Federica referred to the fact that you really need to place a child in the right situation, and that may go to the kind of reception conditions that they're placed in, whether it's foster families or small specialized centers or bigger centers. It's frequently found that children in smaller centers, perhaps unsurprisingly, do better, and it's from the bigger centers that many of the children disappear. Now, of course, we also need to be very, very realistic, putting in place good, proper reception, informing the child, supporting the child. They can help reduce the overall number of disappearances, but it's clearly very difficult to remove the risk entirely. and much more work needs to go into the law and policy, in particular to establish procedures that can find and deliver durable solutions for children. The third principle, and again it seems very straightforward, is that basic information on the child's circumstances should be gathered and should be available to help actors follow up on disappearances. And I mean, once we've seen that that's a very challenging aspect of investigating the disappearance of an unaccompanied child from another country, because unlike a citizen child where there might be quite a few sources of information on the child and their circumstances, in the case of an unaccompanied child who's come in from another country, often the most important source of information is the child themselves, and if they've disappeared, that information has also disappeared. So there is important personal information that can be gathered at different points, when fulfilling the standard legal obligations like registration, like individual needs screening, and when engaging in family tracing efforts. And of course, paying due regard to data protection and privacy, there is a need to capture this information. And the handbook contains some practical suggestions about how to do that. There are, of course, sensitivities about what kind of information can be collected. I mean, to what extent should unaccompanied children be systematically fingerprinted, and by whom and for what purposes? And what about the use of DNA? And again, the Fundamental Rights Agency has been researching the use of biometric data in the EU IT systems in this area of asylum and immigration, and they're looking at the fundamental rights implications, both negative and positive, for doing that. Moving on to another principle that has been mentioned, of course, already, that actors need to work together. And to do so effectively, you need to have a multidisciplinary and interagency approach. And we hear that general statement a lot, but what does it actually mean? And of course, in its most basic, it means combining the different roles, authorities, and specialized skills of actors so that you can really address and respond to disappearances comprehensively. And that can concern cooperation, should concern both work at individual case level, but also at a general level in terms of building and sharing knowledge on the general risks of trafficking, for example, or on migration routes. And again, many of the principles in the Commission reflection paper on integrated child protection systems are relevant here. And that in particular talks about putting in place protocols and processes. It emphasizes training on identification of risks. And again, as Federica said, part of the goal of this seminar and the handbook is to stimulate and support discussions at national level on how to establish or deepen cooperation on this issue, in particular between all of those in the world of child protection, hotlines, law enforcement, and immigration. And I guess it's something for you all to think about, depending on your role, how you can contribute to that. The last principle is also on working together, but the point is it's working together across borders. The unaccompanied children move or are moved by third parties between countries, and the border should not be a barrier to child safeguarding. And again, increasingly at EU level, this is recognised, and indeed the EU would have a special role in setting up appropriate cross-border cooperation. One very specific cross-border mechanism to mention is the Schengen Information System, and they have alerts on missing children, which are made available to police officers and border guards in all of the EU and Schengen countries that participate in this system. So it contains information to identify the missing child, as well as an instruction to place the child under protection. And there are ongoing measures to look at improving these cross-border mechanisms further. But with that, I will end. As you've seen, we tried to keep this very basic and straightforward, and of course very much rooted in the findings. And as Federica said, the manual also looked to provide some practical tools that can help you put those principles in action. And I'm going to return the floor to Federica in a moment. Just first, we had a poll, which was to ask you, and if Jenny, if I can ask you to put up the poll, I hope we have a poll, but the poll was to ask you where you think more work needs to be done in these particular areas. Where does the application of these principles need to be strengthened in your country? So if again, if we could have a quick look at where you think, yeah. Very interesting. That's really helpful. I feel like filling in the cooperation with actors in other countries myself, just to add, thank you, whoever did that. But I think we do, yeah, we can see that obviously across the board, things need to happen. And working with agencies, working together is very important as well, and the proper reception as well. Getting information about the child, in practical terms, that's very important actually, and it'll be interesting to look at some of the tools suggested in the project for that. Listen, thank you very much for sharing that. That's really helpful. I'll hand over to Federica.
Thank you, Rebecca. So just to conclude, we wanted to give you a short overview of some of the tools that are included in the handbook, because indeed we cannot go through the whole handbook itself, but what we can is to maybe create some appetite for you to download it and use it in your everyday work. We hope, indeed, the handbook, as we said before, is supposed to provide some guidance and inform you of good practices that have been developed, and also it can be the basis for further training in preventing and response to disappearance of migrant children. As I briefly mentioned before, the handbook is available online in our website, and the website is mentioned in the chat, but in any case it's www.missingchildreneurope.eu/summit. So the handbook is available in English, but we have extracted from the handbook some selected templates, checklists and guidance that at the moment is translated in French, Italian, Spanish and Greek, and soon will be translated in German. And of course, we hope within the next months to be able to have even more translations, but this is to be seen. So the handbook contains, as I said, several practical tools. Among those, there are the following: a template for collecting information on the unaccompanied child, a template of actions to be taken where there is a risk that the child will abscond, a template for reporting the disappearance of an unaccompanied child, and for cooperation between hotlines for missing children in cross-border cases. To give you an idea of what I mean with template, here a snapshot of the template for collection of information on an unaccompanied child, which responds to what we have identified before as a challenge, the fact that often information are collected by different actors in different moments. The template is indeed longer than this. This is just the beginning of it. But another example that may be interesting for you is the template of actions to be taken in case of obvious concern of risk of disappearance. This is again just the beginning of it, but among the main points that you will find in this template, there are the basic actions to be taken. So, for example, the fact of introducing yourself to the child, to point to the dangers and risks that will happen in case the child will decide to proceed on their own. And also the basic fact of, for example, let them shower, eat and rest. There are also some attention points, some points that need to be taken in special consideration. For example, the fact that the child may have passport, cash money or mobile phone, and what could be done with this and what could be discussed with the child around these tools. And also the fact, for example, that internet is a very, very important tool that can be used to contact other people outside the center or the family. So this is also something that probably a person would like to discuss with the child. There are also some tips in this template on what to do to reduce the risk that the child would go missing. And just among them, I can mention the fact of give them as much information as possible, including why they are in the center, who put them in the center, for how long they are supposed to stay, and what is the center's mission, and what are the center's tasks, and the person that is talking with the child as well. And also there are some suggestions on what to do during the first 24 hours from the moment when the child was brought to the center, because these 24 hours have been proven to be very critical in the decision of a child to leave. And among the suggestions included in the template, there is the fact of making a little plan or appointments for the following hours or days in order to give a framework to the child, give them some points, some expectations as well for the next days. Offer them things like, for example, food, something to drink, in order to help the creation of this, in order to help building the trust with the child, and also be very transparent with the child in order to make sure that the child believes in what you're saying and understands that you're there to for their best interest and in their interest. This is just some of the elements that are included in the template. In the handbook, you will also find some checklists. For example, you will find a checklist of information to be provided to unaccompanied children as a means to prevent disappearance, checklist of elements to consider when assessing the likelihood that the child will go missing, a checklist of immediate actions to be taken when a child is found after absconding, and checklist of elements to be included in a memorandum of understanding with other authorities or other actors on how to respond to disappearances. So here, for example, a snap of the checklist on risk assessment. I'm not sure if you can read it properly, but as I said, it's definitely in the handbook. And among what is included in this checklist, there is, for example, the fact of creating a list of standardized indicators to be built based on your expertise and the context that you're working. But indicators that are known to everyone working with you, with an accompanied child, and that are used consistently when assessing the risk that the child would go missing. Another example of a checklist, as I said, is the elements to be taken into account when evaluating the risk of disappearances. And among them, I can probably mention the fact of, for example, the fact that the child is not really interested in what you're explaining to them, or the child looks nervous, looks at his phone. So simple indicators that can definitely help you in assessing the risk that the child is about to go missing, or there is someone that wants him to go missing. There is also some guidance on how to cooperate with law enforcement, which is useful for NGOs and authorities that are not law enforcement authorities, and for law enforcement itself. Some of this guidance is specifically targeting cooperation when the child is a victim of trafficking. At the very end of the handbook, we have included a summary template on ownership, complementarity, and coordination between agencies involved. It's an overview that suggests possible roles that every actor could play in preventing and responding to disappearances and in the aftercare. It foresees a list of actions, including some that can be taken jointly by different actors, and which the lead is to be defined by the stakeholders involved. It is important that the template will serve as a basis for discussion between the stakeholders involved on which task belongs to whom, which we believe after the study and after having analyzed the findings is extremely important in terms of preventing and responding to disappearances. There is often confusion on who is responsible for what in the prevention and the response to disappearance, and it is important that this is clarified and known by all the parties involved, and often also monitored in its application. So we have created this templates specifically looking at prevention, response, and aftercare. And as you can see, they refer to reception centers, operators, or social services, guardians, hotlines for missing children, and law enforcement. As I said, they are at the end of the handbook, so even if you cannot read now, don't worry, because it's much clearer in the downloadable version. But we do believe that it's important in every context in which you work to come together with the other actors involved, discuss what are your tasks and others' tasks, and come to an agreement of who's responsible for what. And we hope that this summary templates may help the discussions around this matter. So just to give you a snap, this is prevention, this is the one related to response, and this is the one related to aftercare. So that was it from our side. We hope that the information that we have provided to you is useful, and we hope that you will decide to use the tools that we have created during your everyday work. Are there any questions from you? For me or for Rebecca? I don't seem to see. It doesn't seem that there are any questions, which I hope means that we have been super clear and they are all already on the website, ready to download the handbook and the study.
Thank you very much, Federica. We will keep the room open in case any of the participants will have questions afterwards. Now I would like to take the opportunity to say that if you would like to get a certificate of attendance for this webinar, please email us at this address. And all the handouts and the presentation will be available on childhub.org website in the webinar section. And also keep an eye on that page for future upcoming webinars. Thank you very much to Federica and Rebecca for a wonderful presentation, and I wish you all a very nice day.